The thunder cracked like a bullwhip across the Montana sky as Rosalie Keller staggered through the pouring rain, her body already burning with fever. She had been riding for 2 days straight from Bitter Creek, desperate to escape the memories that haunted her there. But now the illness that had been creeping through her veins had finally overwhelmed her. The year was 1878, and the frontier was unforgiving to those who traveled alone. Rosalie had never intended to make this journey by herself, but circumstances had forced her hand. Her horse, faithful companion that he was, sensed her weakening grip on the reins and slowed his pace, allowing her to remain mounted despite her deteriorating condition. Through blurred vision, she spotted a small cabin nestled against a stand of pines. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth and perhaps mercy from whoever dwelled inside. With the last of her strength, she guided her horse toward the light. "Hello?" she called weakly, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Is anyone there?" She slumped forward, her forehead resting against her horse's wet mane as consciousness began to slip away. The cabin door swung open, and a tall figure rushed out into the rain. Rosalie was vaguely aware of strong arms catching her as she fell from her saddle. "Hold on, miss," a deep voice said. "I've got you." The next thing she knew, she was being carried inside, rainwater dripping from both their bodies onto a rough wooden floor. Ranger Adams had been a solitary man since returning from the war 13 years ago. He preferred the company of his horses and the vast Montana wilderness to that of people. His cabin, built with his own hands, stood as a testament to his desire for independence. He'd never expected to find a half-dead woman on his doorstep during one of the worst storms of the season. He laid her gently on his bed, noting the unnatural flush of her cheeks and the heat radiating from her skin. Fever, and a bad one at that. He'd seen enough sickness during the war to recognize when someone was fighting for their life. "Can you hear me, miss?" he asked, his calloused hand brushing wet hair from her face. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of summer sage. "Water," she whispered. Ranger moved quickly, fetching a tin cup and filling it from his water barrel. He helped her sit up slightly, supporting her head as she drank. "Thank you," she managed. "I'm Rosalie. Rosalie Keller." "Ranger Adams," he replied. "You're mighty sick, Miss Keller. You need to rest." She nodded weakly before her eyes rolled back and she lost consciousness again. Ranger set to work removing her wet outer clothing, keeping her modesty intact by covering her with his warmest quilt. He placed another log on the fire and began heating water. His medical knowledge was limited to what he'd learned on the battlefield and from the local Blackfoot tribe who occasionally traded with him. He knew enough to recognize typhoid or similar fevers, and the treatment was largely the same: keep the patient cool, ensure they drank plenty of fluids, and pray. Ranger soaked a cloth in cool water and placed it on Rosalie's forehead. He had questions, many of them about what a woman was doing riding alone in such conditions, but they would have to wait. For now, his only concern was keeping her alive through the night. As darkness fell, Ranger fashioned himself a pallet on the floor near the hearth. He dozed fitfully, waking every hour to check on his unexpected guest. Around midnight, her moaning drew him instantly to her side. The fever had intensified. She thrashed weakly, mumbling incoherent words. Her fever took hold again at midnight. The cowboy prayed quietly and changed the cloth on her head. "Lord," he whispered, "I don't know this woman or her story, but I ask that you spare her. Give her strength to fight this sickness." Ranger continued his vigil through the night, replacing the cloth when it grew too warm, coaxing water between her parched lips whenever she was conscious enough to swallow. By dawn, his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. But Rosalie's breathing seemed slightly steadier. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow across the valley. Ranger tended to his horses, bringing Rosalie's mount into his small stable alongside his own gelding and mare. The animal was exhausted but otherwise healthy, a fine Arabian that spoke of wealth and breeding far beyond a typical frontier woman's means. When he returned to the cabin, Rosalie was awake, though clearly disoriented. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice raspy. "My cabin, about 15 miles east of Fort Benton," Ranger replied, pouring her fresh water. "You rode in during the storm last night, burning with fever." Gratitude flickered in her eyes as she accepted the cup. "I remember, a little. You've been caring for me." It wasn't a question, but Ranger nodded anyway. "You've been mighty sick. Still are. You shouldn't be traveling for at least a few days." A shadow crossed her face. "I can't stay. I need to keep moving." "Miss Keller, with all due respect, you can barely sit up. Whatever you're running from will have to wait until you're strong enough not to fall dead from your saddle." Her eyes widened slightly at his perception, then narrowed. "You don't understand." "No, I don't," he agreed, stirring a pot of simple broth he'd started. "And you don't need to explain anything to me. But the facts remain, you're ill. There's 2 feet of snow outside, and the next town is a day's ride in good conditions." Rosalie sank back against the pillows, defeat evident in the slump of her shoulders. 2 days, she conceded. "Then I must continue." Ranger didn't argue. 2 days might be enough for her fever to break if she was lucky. If not, well, they'd face that challenge when it came. The following hours established a quiet routine. Ranger tended to his daily chores while keeping a watchful eye on Rosalie's condition. By midday, he'd coaxed some broth into her, and she slept more peacefully afterward. When she woke again, the shadows had lengthened across the cabin floor. Ranger sat at his small table, mending a bridle. "You have gentle hands for a cowboy," she observed, catching him by surprise. He glanced up, a hint of a smile touching his usually stern face. "And you have a sharp tongue for a woman at death's door." Unexpectedly, she laughed, though it quickly turned into a cough. "I've been told my spirit is stronger than my sense." "That I can believe," Ranger replied, setting aside his work. "Are you hungry?" She nodded, and he brought her more broth, this time with small pieces of dried venison. As she ate, Ranger found himself studying her more carefully. Despite the illness that had ravaged her, he could see she was beautiful, not in the delicate, cultivated way of Eastern women, but with a strength and determination that seemed to radiate from within. "Tell me about this place," she said, gesturing around the cabin. "Have you lived here long?" 8 years, he replied. "Built it myself after I got tired of drifting." "And before that?" Ranger hesitated. He rarely spoke of his past, even with the few people he considered friends. "War," he said simply. "Then cattle drives, ranch work, whatever paid enough to keep moving." Rosalie seemed to understand his reluctance. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry." "No harm in asking," he assured her. "What about you? What brings a lady like yourself to Montana territory alone?" She looked down at her bowl, her fingers tightening around it. "Freedom," she said after a long moment. "I'm seeking a new beginning." Ranger knew there was more to the story, much more, but he respected her privacy. Everyone on the frontier had something in their past they'd rather leave behind. As night fell again, Rosalie's fever returned, though less severe than before. Ranger kept his vigil, changing the cloth on her forehead and speaking softly when nightmares seemed to trouble her sleep. "You're safe here," he found himself saying, unsure if she could even hear him. "Rest easy." By morning, a marked improvement was evident. Rosalie sat up without assistance and managed to eat a more substantial breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with the last of Ranger's precious honey. "Your cooking is surprisingly good," she commented. "Necessity," he replied with a shrug. "Can't very well ride into town every time I want a decent meal." "And do you? Ride into town often?" "Every few weeks for supplies. Otherwise, I keep to myself." Rosalie studied him thoughtfully. Don't you get lonely out here? The question struck Ranger in an unexpected way. He'd never considered loneliness as something separate from his existence. It simply was, like the mountains or the changing seasons. I have my horses, he said finally, and visitors occasionally. He gave her a pointed look that made her smile. Well, I appreciate your hospitality, Mr. Adams, especially given the circumstances. Ranger, he corrected. Just Ranger. Ranger, she repeated, and something about the way his name sounded in her voice made his chest tighten peculiarly. The second day of Rosalie's stay brought clearer skies and continued improvement in her condition. She insisted on getting out of bed, though Ranger hovered nearby, ready to catch her if her strength failed. It didn't. Despite her lingering weakness, she moved with determination, examining his modest cabin with genuine interest. You've made this place quite comfortable, she observed, running her fingers over a shelf of books that surprised her with their variety from practical manuals on horse breeding to volumes of poetry and philosophy. It serves its purpose, Ranger replied, watching as she explored. He found himself noticing small details about her, the graceful way she moved, how she tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear when concentrating, the small scar at the corner of her right eyebrow. What happened there? He asked impulsively, gesturing to the scar. Rosalie's fingers went to it automatically, a small smile playing at her lips. I fell from a tree when I was 9. My father was furious, said proper young ladies don't climb trees. And did that stop you? Not in the slightest, she admitted with a mischievous glint in her eye. I just became better at not getting caught. Ranger found himself chuckling, the sound rusty from disuse. Somehow that doesn't surprise me. As dusk approached, Rosalie sat wrapped in a blanket by the window, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape. It's beautiful here, she said softly, so vast and untamed. Ranger nodded, stoking the fire. That's why I chose it. No neighbors to bother you? Something like that. Rosalie turned to face him. You're a mystery, Ranger Adams. Most men I've known can't stop talking about themselves. Yet you reveal so little. Not much to tell, he said with a shrug. And you're one to talk about mysteries. A well-bred woman riding alone through Montana territory in winter? She tensed visibly. How do you know I'm well-bred? Your speech, your hands, that Arabian outside, all tell a story of privilege. Rosalie looked away. Perhaps once. Not anymore. Ranger didn't press further, but later that evening, as they shared a simple supper of rabbit stew, she spoke unprompted. I was married, she said quietly, to a banker in St. Louis, Jeffrey Winters. Ranger waited, sensing there was more she needed to say. He was cruel. Not at first. At first he was charming, generous. My parents were delighted with the match. She stared into her bowl. 3 years of marriage taught me the difference between public facades and private truths. He hurt you, Ranger stated, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. In ways that left no visible scars mostly, she confirmed. Until recently. She broke off, swallowing hard. He discovered I had been secretly teaching literacy to the children of our household staff. He believed education would make them dissatisfied with their station. The argument became physical. Ranger's hand tightened around his spoon. And you ran. Rosalie nodded. With help from our cook. She had family in Helena. I was heading there when the fever struck. Does he seek you? With every resource at his disposal, she said bitterly. I took something when I left. Something important to him. Ranger raised an eyebrow questioningly. Evidence, she said, of fraud. Enough to ruin him if made public. A small, fierce smile crossed her face. My insurance policy, you might say. Ranger considered this information carefully. That's why you're so determined to keep moving. Yes. Every day I remain in one place increases the risk. The implications were clear. By staying at his cabin, she had potentially led danger to his doorstep as well. Ranger should have been concerned about this, perhaps even angry. Instead, he found himself oddly resolved. "We'll leave at first light," he said. "I'll accompany you to Helena." Surprise flickered across Rosalie's face. "That's not necessary. I've imposed enough." "It's not an imposition," Ranger interrupted. "It's common sense. You're still recovering, the weather's unpredictable, and from what you've told me, this husband of yours isn't the type to send polite inquiries if he tracks you down." "Why would you risk yourself for a stranger?" she asked, genuine confusion in her voice. Ranger considered the question. Why indeed? He'd spent years cultivating his solitude, avoiding entanglements of any kind. Yet something about Rosalie Keller had breached defenses he hadn't even realized he'd built. "Let's just say I have my own quarrels with men who abuse power," he finally replied. "Get some rest. We have an early start tomorrow." That night, Rosalie's fever returned one final time, less severe but enough to concern Ranger. He resumed his post beside her bed, replacing the cool cloth on her forehead and murmuring reassurances when she grew restless. "Ranger?" she whispered during a lucid moment. "Are you praying?" He paused, caught off guard by the observation. "Yes," he admitted. "Does that trouble you?" "No," she said softly. "It's comforting. I stopped believing prayers were answered long ago." "Sometimes the answer takes time," he replied, "and sometimes it comes in forms we don't expect." Rosalie's hand found his in the darkness. "Thank you. Not just for this, but for believing me. For not judging." Ranger's throat tightened unexpectedly. "Sleep now," he managed. "Dawn comes early." He remained by her side, their hands still joined, long after she drifted back to sleep. Morning brought clear skies and a marked improvement in Rosalie's condition. The fever had broken during the night, leaving her weak but determined. Ranger packed provisions for their journey, along with extra ammunition for the rifle he rarely used, but maintained meticulously. "Can you ride?" he asked as Rosalie emerged from the cabin dressed in her now dried clothing, supplemented with a heavy wool shirt he'd insisted she take. "Yes," she said, with more confidence than he expected. "I've been riding since childhood." "Good. It's a 3-day journey to Helena in these conditions. We'll stop at Fort Benton tonight to resupply." They set out as the sun crested the eastern mountains, casting long shadows across the pristine snow. Ranger led the way, frequently glancing back to ensure Rosalie was managing. Despite her recent illness, she sat tall in the saddle, handling her spirited Arabian with evident skill. "You ride well," he commented when they paused to rest the horses midday. "My father raised thoroughbreds," she explained. "It was the one passion we shared." A shadow crossed her face. "He disowned me when Jeffrey revealed I'd fled. At least, I assume he did. The telegram arrived the day after I left." "Some men value appearances over truth," Ranger said. "It's their loss." The simplicity of his statement seemed to touch Rosalie deeply. She blinked rapidly and turned away, pretending to adjust her saddle. They reached Fort Benton by nightfall, securing rooms at the modest hotel near the steamboat landing. Despite his preference for privacy, Ranger insisted on taking supper in the public dining room. "Better to be seen openly," he explained. "Draws less attention than skulking about." Rosalie wore her hair tucked beneath a hat Ranger had given her and kept her face partially concealed behind a cup of coffee. "Do you think he could have men this far west already?" she asked quietly. "Possible, but not likely," Ranger replied. Still, caution costs nothing. As they ate, Ranger noticed Rosalie watching a family at a nearby table, parents with 3 young children who laughed and squabbled over their meal. Something wistful crossed her face. "Did you want children?" he asked, surprising himself with the personal question. "Yes," she admitted. But Jeffrey had no interest. He claimed business concerns demanded his full attention. But I later discovered he kept a mistress who had already borne him 2 children. Her bitter smile didn't reach her eyes. Apparently, I was suitable for public appearances, but not for motherhood. His judgment seems consistently flawed, Ranger observed dryly, earning a genuine laugh from Rosalie that turned heads at nearby tables. They retired early, agreeing to meet at dawn to continue their journey. Ranger lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling, his mind unusually active. In just 3 days, Rosalie Keller had disrupted the careful isolation he'd constructed for himself. More troubling was the realization that he didn't mind. Morning brought unexpected challenges. As they prepared to depart, Ranger noticed 2 well-dressed men watching the hotel entrance from across the street. Something in their bearing too alert, too focused, triggered his instincts. "Change of plans," he told Rosalie casually as they saddled their horses. "We'll take the North Trail instead." She followed his gaze and stiffened. "Are those—" "Can't be certain, but why take chances?" He adjusted his gun belt subtly. "Follow my lead." They rode out openly but diverted from the main road as soon as they cleared the town limits. Ranger led them through a series of ravines and dry creek beds, effectively obscuring their trail. "You know these lands well," Rosalie observed as they emerged onto a high plateau overlooking the Missouri River. "Spent time scouting during the war," he explained. "Terrain reading becomes second nature." They rode hard that day, stopping only when necessary. By nightfall, they'd covered more ground than Ranger had anticipated. But Rosalie was clearly exhausted, the lingering effects of her illness evident in her pale face and trembling hands. "We'll make camp here," he decided, selecting a sheltered spot beneath an outcropping of rock. "It's defensible and hidden from the trail." "I'm sorry," Rosalie said as she dismounted stiffly. "I'm slowing us down." "You're doing remarkably well for someone who was at death's door 3 days ago," Ranger countered. "Rest. I'll take first watch." He built a small, smokeless fire and prepared a simple meal while Rosalie spread their bedrolls. The domestic normalcy of the scene struck Ranger with unexpected force. How long had it been since he'd shared a campfire with anyone, let alone a woman? As they ate, Rosalie broke the comfortable silence. "Tell me something about yourself, Ranger." "Something real." He considered deflecting but found himself unwilling to maintain the barriers he usually kept firmly in place. "I was engaged once," he said finally, "before the war. Her name was Elizabeth." Rosalie waited patiently as he gathered his thoughts. "I returned a different man than the one who left," he continued. "Harder, quieter." She tried to understand, but he shrugged. "Some changes can't be bridged." "What happened?" "She married the town doctor while I was drifting through Nevada. Good man. Kind. Stable." He poked at the fire with a stick. He could give her the life she deserved. "And you've been alone since?" "By choice," Ranger emphasized. "Found I preferred it that way." Rosalie studied him across the flames. "Did you prefer it? Or was it just easier than risking disappointment again?" The question hit uncomfortably close to truths Ranger rarely examined. "Both, maybe," he admitted. "What about you? After you reach Helena, what then?" "I haven't thought that far ahead," she confessed. "Safety first. Then, a fresh start somewhere. Teaching, perhaps. It's what I always wanted to do." "You'd be good at it," Ranger said, surprising them both with his certainty. Rosalie smiled, the firelight catching the gold flecks in her green eyes. "Thank you for believing that." Something shifted between them in that moment, something profound, yet as delicate as spun glass. Neither acknowledged it aloud, but when their hands brushed as they prepared for sleep, Neither pulled away immediately. The third day of travel dawned clear and cold. They made good progress through the morning, the landscape gradually changing as they approached the mountains surrounding Helena. By midday, Ranger estimated they were less than half a day's ride from their destination. "We should reach Helena by nightfall," he told Rosalie as they paused beside a rushing stream to water the horses. She nodded, but her expression was troubled. And then? Ranger had been avoiding this question in his own mind. "I'll see you safely to your friend's home," he said carefully. "Make sure you're settled. And then you'll return to your cabin," she finished for him. That was the plan, he acknowledged, though the words felt hollow even to his own ears. Rosalie turned away, busying herself with adjusting her saddle. "Of course. I appreciate all you've done, Ranger. Truly." He wanted to say more, but was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats, multiple riders approaching quickly. Ranger's hand went instinctively to his gun. "Into the trees," he ordered quietly. "Now." They led their horses into the dense pine forest bordering the stream, concealing themselves just as 4 riders came into view. Even at a distance, Ranger could tell these weren't ordinary travelers. They rode with purpose, scanning the landscape systematically. The leader was expensively dressed, his bearing imperious. Beside him, Rosalie inhaled sharply. "Geoffrey," she whispered, her face draining of color. Ranger studied the man more carefully. Geoffrey Winters appeared to be in his early 40s, with the sleek, well-fed look of someone accustomed to luxury. The 3 men accompanying him had the unmistakable bearing of hired guns. "How did he find us?" Rosalie's voice trembled slightly. "Likely paid for information at every stop between St. Louis and here," Ranger replied grimly. "Money talks, especially in frontier towns." The riders paused at the stream, examining the ground. One dismounted, pointing at the fresh hoofprints their horses had left in the mud. "They know we're close," Ranger murmured. "We need to move. Quietly." They retreated deeper into the forest, leading their horses carefully to minimize sound. Ranger's mind raced through options, none of them ideal. A direct confrontation would be dangerous. 4 against 1 were poor odds, even with his experience. Fleeing toward Helena might lead Winters straight to Rosalie's refuge. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 2 miles north," he decided. "We can hole up there until dark, then circle around to approach Helena from the west." Rosalie nodded, her earlier exhaustion seemingly forgotten in the face of immediate danger. They moved as quickly as stealth allowed, listening for pursuit. The forest remained quiet, but Ranger took no chances, frequently doubling back or creating false trails. The trapper's cabin was little more than a crude shelter, a single room with a dirt floor and a stone fireplace, but its location provided excellent visibility of the surrounding area. Rangers secured their horses in a small natural enclosure formed by boulders behind the cabin. "We should be safe here temporarily," he told Rosalie. "They'll likely continue along the main trail toward Helena." She nodded, but remained tense, her gaze constantly drawn to the cabin's single window. "I knew he would come," she said quietly. "He can't stand to lose, especially not to me." "The documents you took, what exactly do they prove?" "That he's been embezzling from his own bank for years," Rosalie replied, "using the funds to finance a second bank under a different name. If the evidence became public, he'd face prison." "Which means he's desperate," Ranger concluded. "Men like that are dangerous." "I'm sorry to have brought this to your door," Rosalie said, genuine remorse in her voice. "This isn't your fight." Ranger surprised himself with his response. "It is now." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of feelings that had grown with unexpected speed and intensity over their short acquaintance. Before either could speak further, the sound of approaching horses shattered the moment. Ranger moved to the window, cursing softly at what he saw. "They've found our trail," he confirmed. 3 riders, coming up the slope." Rosalie joined him, peering cautiously out the window. Only 3? Where's Jeffrey? Can't see him. Maybe he sent his men ahead. Ranger checked his revolver. Stay here, I'll circle around behind them. No. Rosalie grabbed his arm. They'll kill you without hesitation. I don't plan on giving them the chance, he assured her, but we need to even the odds. Before she could protest further, he slipped out the back of the cabin and disappeared into the trees. Rosalie pressed herself against the wall beside the window, her heart pounding. Through the dingy glass, she watched as the 3 men approached, spreading out to surround the cabin. Ranger moved silently through the forest, using skills honed during the war. He positioned himself behind a large boulder that provided cover while allowing him to observe the hired guns. They were professionals, moving with coordinated precision that confirmed his suspicions about their backgrounds. The lead man signaled the others to hold position while he approached the cabin door. Ranger saw his opportunity and took it. A sharp whistle similar to a hawk's cry drew the attention of the 2 outlying men. When one turned toward the sound, Ranger fired, hitting the man in the shoulder. The injured gunman's cry alerted his companions, who immediately sought cover. Inside the cabin, Rosalie flinched at the sound of gunfire. The man at the door instantly changed tactics, kicking it open and diving inside, gun drawn. Rosalie was ready. She swung the heavy iron poker from the fireplace with all her strength, catching the intruder across the shoulders. He sprawled forward, his gun skittering across the dirt floor. Rosalie lunged for the weapon, but the man recovered quickly, grabbing her ankle. She kicked free and scrambled backward as he pulled himself to his feet. "Mrs. Winters," he drawled, producing a knife from his boot. "Your husband wants a word." "My name is Keller," she spat. "And I have nothing to say to Jeffrey." Outside, Ranger was exchanging fire with the 3rd gunman, both men sheltered behind trees. The wounded man had retreated but remained a threat. Ranger needed to end this quickly and get back to Rosalie. Taking a calculated risk, he broke cover, firing rapidly as he moved to flank his opponent. The gunman, momentarily confused by Ranger's bold move, hesitated just long enough. Ranger's bullet found its mark, and the man crumpled to the ground. Inside the cabin, Rosalie was backed against the fireplace as her attacker advanced. She feinted left, then darted right, trying to reach the door. The man anticipated her move, cutting off her escape. His knife glinted in the dim light. "Dead or alive, makes no difference to me," he growled. "But Mr. Winters pays extra for alive." The cabin door burst open, distracting the attacker momentarily. It was all the time Ranger needed. His first shot struck the man's knife hand, causing the blade to drop harmlessly to the floor. His second hit center mass, and the gunman staggered backward before collapsing. Ranger quickly checked that the threat was neutralized, then turned to Rosalie. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though she was trembling visibly. "Where's Jeffrey?" "Not among them," Ranger confirmed, moving to secure the injured man outside. "But he can't be far." He returned moments later, his expression grim. "The wounded man says Winters is waiting on the main road with reinforcements. These 3 were sent to flush us out." "What do we do?" Rosalie asked. Ranger considered their options. "We need to move now, while we still have daylight. There's a back trail that leads west, then loops around to Helena. It's rough country, but navigable." They gathered their belongings quickly. Ranger took weapons and ammunition from the fallen gunman, offering a pistol to Rosalie. "Do you know how to use this?" "My father taught me," she said, checking the chamber with practiced ease that surprised him. They mounted up and rode hard away from the cabin, following a barely visible game trail that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. The sun was sinking low by the time they reached a high ridge overlooking a narrow valley. "We'll rest the horses here briefly," Ranger decided. "There's water in that creek below." As they dismounted, Rosalie suddenly stiffened, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. "Ranger," she said quietly. "Look." Following her pointing finger, he spotted a plume of dust rising from the valley floor, riders approaching from the east. "How many?" she asked. Ranger squinted against the setting sun. "6, maybe 7. Moving fast." "Jeffrey," Rosalie said with certainty. "He always was persistent." The grimness of their situation wasn't lost on either of them. They were outnumbered, with exhausted horses and limited ammunition. Night was approaching, which offered concealment but also dangers of its own in the unfamiliar terrain. "We have 2 choices," Ranger said. "Make a stand here where we have the high ground, or try to outrun them to Helena." Rosalie considered the options, her face resolute. "I'm tired of running," she said finally, "and I won't risk innocent lives in Helena if we lead them there." Ranger nodded, a surge of admiration and something deeper swelling in his chest. "Then we stand." They positioned themselves behind a natural stone barricade near the ridge's edge. Ranger distributed their remaining ammunition between them. "Aim carefully," he advised. "Make every shot count." As the riders drew closer, Ranger could make out Jeffrey Winters at the lead, distinguished by his fine coat and the authoritative way he directed his men. They approached cautiously, clearly aware of the tactical disadvantage they faced attacking uphill. When the riders were within hailing distance, Winters raised a hand, signaling his men to halt. He rode forward alone, stopping at the base of the ridge. "Rosalie," he called up, "this foolishness has gone on long enough. Come down, and I'll be merciful." Ranger glanced at Rosalie. Her knuckles were white around the grip of her pistol, but her voice was steady when she replied. "Your mercy isn't worth much, Jeffrey. I have the ledgers. By now, copies have reached the authorities." This was news to Ranger, and from the way Winter's face contorted with rage, it was clearly unexpected to him as well. "You're bluffing," Winters shouted. "You wouldn't know how to arrange such things." 3 years as your wife taught me a great deal about planning ahead," Rosalie called back. "Leave now, Jeffrey. It's over." Winter's response was to signal his men forward. They spread out, preparing to ascend the ridge from multiple angles. "Ready?" Ranger asked quietly. Rosalie nodded, her face set with determination. "Ready." The first shots came from Winter's men, bullets ricocheting off the rocks around them. Ranger and Rosalie returned fire selectively, focusing on the nearest threats. One of Winter's men fell, then another was wounded, sliding back down the rocky slope. The exchange continued as dusk deepened into twilight. Ranger knew they were running dangerously low on ammunition. He was considering a desperate plan to draw fire away from Rosalie when the distant sound of multiple horses approaching from the west caught his attention. Winters heard it too. He signaled his men to hold position, turning to face the new threat. Around the bend in the valley floor appeared a group of riders, at least a dozen, moving in tight formation. At their head rode a man in the distinctive uniform of a U.S. Marshal. "Marshal Durham," Rosalie breathed, relief evident in her voice. "He got my letter." "Your letter?" Ranger asked. "I sent it from Fort Benton," she explained, "while you were securing supplies. Insurance against exactly this situation." The arrival of law enforcement changed the dynamics instantly. Winter's men, hired guns with no loyalty beyond their pay, began to melt away into the gathering darkness. Winters himself remained, his face a mask of fury as he watched his advantage disappear. When Marshal Durham called for him to surrender, Winters made his choice. He spurred his horse directly up the ridge toward Rosalie's position, firing wildly as he came. Ranger moved instinctively, placing himself between Rosalie and the oncoming threat. He fired his last 2 bullets with careful precision. The first struck Winter's shoulder, but the banker kept coming. The second hit his chest, toppling him from his saddle. He tumbled down the rocky slope, coming to rest motionless at its base. The aftermath unfolded with surprising speed. Marshal Durham secured the scene while a deputy tended to Winters, confirming what Ranger already knew: the banker was dead. Mrs. Keller, Durham said, approaching where Rosalie stood trembling beside Ranger. Your evidence arrived yesterday. We were already preparing to make arrests when your second message reached us. Thank you for coming, she said quietly. I wasn't certain you would. The Treasury Department takes bank fraud very seriously, Durham replied, especially on this scale. As the lawmen dealt with the remaining captives, Ranger led Rosalie a short distance away, finding a quiet spot where they could finally breathe. You never mentioned the letter, he said. I wasn't certain it would reach him, she replied, or that he would believe me without the actual ledgers. Which you sent ahead from Fort Benton as well. She nodded. With a steamboat captain I trusted, another contingency. You're remarkably resourceful, Ranger observed, genuine admiration in his voice. I had to be. Her composure finally cracked, the strain of the past days catching up with her. It's over, she whispered, as if hardly daring to believe it. Truly over. Ranger hesitated only briefly before drawing her into his arms. She came willingly, her body fitting against his as if designed for that purpose. He held her while she wept not tears of sorrow but of relief, of release from years of fear and constraint. When she finally looked up at him, her face tear-streaked but peaceful, Ranger knew with absolute certainty that he could never return to his solitary existence. Not now. Not after her. What happens now? He asked softly. I'm free, she said simply. Free to become whoever I choose to be. And who might that be? A small smile touched her lips. I'm not entirely sure yet, but I think she'll be someone braver than before. Someone who doesn't hide from life. Ranger brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. Sounds like someone I'd like to know better. I was hoping you'd say that, Rosalie admitted. Because I've grown rather fond of a certain reclusive cowboy who preys over feverish strangers and faces down gunmen without flinching. The journey to Helena that night was peaceful, with Marshal Durham and his deputies providing escort. Rosalie rode beside Ranger, their shoulders occasionally brushing in the darkness. Neither spoke much, but the silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken possibilities. 1 year later, a small schoolhouse stood on the outskirts of Helena. Inside, Rosalie Adams moved among the desks, helping her young students with their letters. Through the window, she could see her husband in the yard, teaching an older boy how to properly groom a horse. The past year had brought changes neither of them could have imagined during those dangerous days on the ridge. With Jeffrey's death and the subsequent investigation, Rosalie had found herself the recipient of a substantial settlement, ill-gotten gains recovered from her late husband's hidden accounts and awarded to her by a sympathetic judge. They'd used the money to build this school and the adjoining house where they lived. Ranger still kept horses, breeding and training them on the small ranch they'd established, but he'd discovered an unexpected talent for teaching the older boys practical skills. His nightmares had diminished, though not disappeared entirely. On the rare nights when they returned, Rosalie held him close until dawn broke. As the school day ended and the children dispersed, Ranger entered the classroom, a smile warming his usually serious face when he saw his wife. "Good day?" he asked, gathering the books she'd left on her desk. "Wonderful," she replied, stretching to ease the ache in her back that had become more pronounced in recent months. Billy Thatcher finally mastered his multiplication tables. Ranger's hand moved to rest gently on the swell of her abdomen. "And how's our newest student doing?" "Active," Rosalie laughed, covering his hand with her own. "Especially when you're talking. I think she recognizes your voice." "She?" Ranger raised an eyebrow. "You sound certain." "Just a feeling," she said with a mysterious smile. "Mother's intuition." They walked home hand in hand through the golden autumn afternoon, their conversation flowing easily from school matters to ranch concerns to plans for the baby's room. Neither mentioned the anniversary. They both remembered 1 year since her fever had taken hold at midnight, since a lonely cowboy had prayed quietly and changed the cloth on her head, setting in motion events that would transform both their lives. Some things didn't need to be spoken aloud to be perfectly understood, like the way rangers still watched over her while she slept, like the prayers of gratitude Rosalie whispered each night for the storm that had led her to his door, like the love that had grown between them unexpected, unplanned, and as vast and enduring as the Montana sky.